Hello, everyone. Glad to be back after a bit of an absence. I think the last episode I had with Dr. Lawrence Krauss, and ever since I haven't streamed anything. But today I'm very happy to resume services and have the magnificent Dr. Robert Price with me. Hello, Bob. How are you?
No, doing great. How about you?
Oh, not too bad. As I said to you offline, I've upgraded the gears, a bigger TV in the back scene there, and all your beautiful action figures that I'm going to value forever, I think. How was your weekend so far?
A little bit under the weather, but the weather's much nicer today, and I don't have the sinus problems I sometimes have. So things are really looking good, and I'm getting a lot done, even when I find that sometimes I can write even more fluently if I'm feeling crummy. It's weird, but everything's going okay.
Sometimes I find it when you're sick or under the weather and you're trying to get one thing done, it gives you more like a focal point because you don't get distracted. You got only the one thing to worry about, and otherwise, if you're really healthy, you get distracted and pulled apart by different people taking your attention or different topics. So sometimes it gives you a bit more focus. Apparently, I heard it from people who are dying as well. I remember Christopher Hitchens. He said, while he knew he was dying, they've given him like 6 or 8 months to go, and he said it's actually given his life a lot of focus.
Wow.
He doesn't have to be distracted anymore. He knows what he needs to focus on in the next 6 to 8 months. So it's quite interesting how situations like this can give you like a focal point.
Heidegger said, in effect, that ought to be everybody's attitude all the time, that they need to recognize that they're moving or really hurtling toward death, no matter how many decades they live. I mean, look at the big picture. And he says, therefore, you must take responsibility for how you're going to live what life you have left. And of course, somebody already said this back in Psalm 90, where the writer speaks of his mortality. And he says, what's the human lifespan? Maybe 70 or 80 years at the most. And then he says, his final prayer is, teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts to wisdom. Well, that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, saying that, I mean, you sort of preach about this sort of clearing your head, but at the end of the day, you just look at both our backgrounds. We like to fill our lives with little things that we really don't need. We still fall in the trap every now and then of the consumerism. It's. It is maybe this is here we go. That's another conversation we could have. Consumerism. Now we have a very interesting topic because this gentleman who we're going to be chatting about today has been quite controversial in so many different ways and different levels. Most people over a long period of time have seen him as a villain. He's the bad guy. Right, he's the betrayer. He's the horrible person. He's the worst. He's the scum. At least when you're fighting and you're like a horrible person, but you're fighting face to face, you're kind of revered. But you're brave. At least you're standing your ground. You're fighting. But this is a backstabber. That's the worst. Nobody likes a backstabber. But is it the case? And maybe I would like to start with, in antiquity, people didn't have surnames. Surnames wasn't, Christ isn't Jesus's family name. It's usually something they're renowned for or a place they come from. So maybe if you can take us a little bit, and you can start the prologue you want to the way you want to start, but a little bit about Judas Iscariot. Who is he?
Yeah, the name thing is very important with him, and I think it can't be resolved because we have an embarrassment of riches here. There are at least three good possibilities. One of them is that it's simply a geographical reference, as you
Mhm.
mentioned, that it could mean Iscariot could represent Ish Kirioth, man of Kirioth, which was part of a name of many villages and just means village. Like the Old Testament has Kiriath Arba and various other ones, and so it's possible that's the case. And the only interesting thing about that one is that though people that know more about the geography than I do say this would imply he was a Judean, not a Galilean like the rest of the disciples.
Mhm.
So again, what difference that would make, I don't know, and I don't know if anybody makes a big deal out of it. But that's a possibility, fairly mundane one. Well, the other two are very interesting. The hottest one is that it means Judas the Sicarius, implying that he was an assassin. That was a type of zealot revolutionary who was an assassin and used the Sicarius, a Roman short sword that you could hide easily up your sleeve, and that the Sicarii would get close to somebody they figured was a quisling collaborating with Rome, or a high priest, maybe, stab him, and then melt into the crowd and start yelling in horror like everybody else. So they, who did this? Who knows? Too late to identify him. And that would be interesting because, as you know, there are a few other disciples of Jesus who go by epithets that might indicate that they were some sort of revolutionists, like Simon the Zealot.
Mhm.
What does that mean? Well, they say, well, pretty obviously it would mean he was a member of the Zealot party, but that's a little difficult, not much, but a little difficult, because the Zealots took that name only during the siege of Jerusalem in 70, though they do seem to represent a movement that goes back a good bit earlier to Judas the Galilean in 6 AD, who led the revolt against Rome then. Okay, so that's possible, and so Simon the Zealot, and well, what does that mean? Is that especially revealing? Well, some say, well, it just could mean that he was a zealot for the law, Paul speaks of himself that way in Galatians, that he had been a zealot for the law. But think of who you're talking about here. This guy is pictured as one of a group of people that had left home, family, and job behind to become itinerant apocalyptic preachers. What would make him stand out as a zealot if he's in a whole crowd of them? But the third meaning would be that it comes from the Aramaic or Hebrew ish uh, Ishkarya, meaning the betrayer, and the man of falsehood, literally. And because that's, of course, what he is. And that would mean that no one referred to him this way during his lifetime. It's
Yeah, it had to
exactly,
be afterwards. Yeah.
like Christ. People weren't saying, as in Superstar, Mr. Christ. In the same way, people weren't saying, hey, ask Mr. Iscariot to come over here. That seems to have been forgotten in Mark, though. For instance, it says, "And Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him." Well, you don't really need to say that if you know what Iscariot meant, and if
Yes.
that's what it meant.
Yeah.
Others come up with things that are theories that are kind of derivative of that, as if it meant Judas the pariah, the outcast. And of course, that would also be later and kind of equivalent in meaning. But those are the three big ones. Now, is does man of Kerioth imply anything about Judas's character or his infamy or anything? Well, not really. That's
Hmm.
when you need to read the story and see what happens. Um, Judas the Sicarius, would that mean anything? Well, yeah, here you have these theories that he was a revolutionist and had great hopes that Jesus was too, and that he would lead the rebellion, as in the Gospel of John, where it says the crowd wanted to take Jesus by force and make him king, but he slipped away from them. He wanted nothing to do with that. Well, it's not unreasonable to suggest Judas was uh, one of those people. And when he saw Jesus wasn't going to lead a revolt, he thought, well, let me force the issue. I
Hmm.
will connect him with the Sanhedrin to so they'll come to arrest him, and then he'll show his true colors. And and that's kind of like if you read the Gospel of John, it's like a cohort, hundreds of soldiers come to arrest Jesus, and he says to them, what have you come against me as against a desperado, is how I translated you, with swords and clubs? Well, yeah, apparently they thought so, and you know the story does have some initial violence, which he then tamps down. So you wonder if maybe there was something to this, and that Jesus went along with it. So that Judas hadn't exactly betrayed him. He was just play acting to trap the authorities into a confrontation.
Yeah. But
It's possible. Um,
don't you agree then, judging by the way the people of the antiquity were named, most likely they're named after the places they come from, like Mary Magdalene, the Paul of Tarsus. You get all sort of, it's a repetitive, it's there. And also it explains another thing, in my opinion. You mentioned that place, the Ishkerot, is most likely to be a Judean, not a Galilean. And if this is the case, his expectations of a Messiah would be aligned with the expectations of the king, of the warrior. Could it be that he sort of followed, he was full of hope, and then discovered that the message has nothing at all to do with the way this is supposed to be led? He get disappointed, and he go, bloody hell, that's not the one then, or I'm just that's not what I signed on for.
yeah, that's the alternative version of the Sicarius uh, choice, because then you're saying once he saw Jesus wasn't going to do anything, he said, "Well, this guy's just lapdog like the others. To hell with him." That could be too. And that would make sense. Uh, let's see. So why, if that isn't what happened, why did he betray Jesus, or hand him over? Actually, is the word. There's always been a theory that makes Judas more sympathetic, saying that he was actually recruited by Jesus to arrange his death, that Jesus had the idea, perhaps based on reading Isaiah chapter 53, that if he really was the Messiah, he had to suffer and die and then be vindicated. And just like in the movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, he lets Judas in on it, and he says, "Look, I'm not doing that." He says, "No, you have to. You're the one I trust most." And so reluctantly, he does it. That's a possibility, and you find something like that in the Gospel according to Judas, that
Yes.
was supposedly discovered, I think, back in the early 70s, but really was released to the public in the early 2000s, I think.
Correct.
And it's, but then it's hard to know. There are reasons for thinking that that is a Morton Smith style hoax perpetrated by Marvin Meyer. That's kind of my operative theory. It was the theory of brother, what's his Richard Arthur, a colleague of mine from the Jesus Seminar. That is conceivable, though. And then you get into that brings up another whole set of motivational possibilities. Who was, and also names, because there was apparently another Judas in the group, depending on which gospel you read. The one, instead of Thaddeus or Theudas, well, I guess I'll just say Thaddeus mentioned in some gospels, in some copies of Matthew, replaced by Lebbaeus, interestingly, whoever he was. But in John, there is instead a Judas, not Iscariot. And of course, the narrator is just saying, well, the other Judas, not the one you're thinking of. And he's not a villain. Well, is it possible this character has been bifurcated, that Judas was and continued to be as far as he was concerned, a disciple of Jesus, but it's possible he was some sort of a heretic, and the other apostles thought, "Hey, what are you talking about? You're distorting the message of the master. You're betraying his truth." And so that he becomes an outcast, and people eventually misunderstand what betrayer denoted. That's conceivable, and this isn't very strong evidence, but the fact that Thomas was called Judas Thomas especially in early Syrian Christian documents, and Thomas is viewed implicitly as a kind of a heretic in the Gospel of John. He's always kind of a skeptic, a doubter, a pessimist, an unbeliever, and in the Gospel of Thomas, he is espousing some Gnostic views like the pre-existence of the soul and so on. And so some have said that, yeah, Judas Iscariot was the same as Thomas. And it's possible, but of course, it's apparent by now we're dealing with little fragments, and that they're different guesses as to what the story was.
Yeah.
And once you get into that, oh man, like, who was Judas Thomas? Thomas means the twin. Whose twin brother was he? Could he be the twin brother of Jesus, who Mark says had a brother named Jude or Judas? Brother. So who the heck? And then that gets into stuff like, what about the resurrection narratives? When they see Jesus' twin brother, does somebody jump the gun and think, oh, it's Jesus, he's back? So it's really, but the big theory about Judas is that he never existed, but is an artificial character meant to represent Jews as a whole who did not accept Jesus as the Messiah, and therefore betrayed him. This is, I think, Chaim Maccabee ventured this theory. Bishop Spong also advocated for this. It would make sense, but then again, loads of guys were named Judas or Judah, or like Judah Maccabee, right? And just like there were loads of Jesus around. And so that doesn't really help us. And you see what?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's one thing we know for sure. There's a lot of speculations here because we don't know much. But one thing we know for sure, that Jesus knew that he was going to be betrayed, and he knew he was going to betray him. And all the four Gospels pretty much mentioned. Maybe it's instead of being told to everyone, it's been whispered into his beloved ears in John. But he knew, and he knew who was going to be doing it. And the question would be, whether Judas was on it or not, it's immaterial. But he had no choice of his own. Judas had to do what he's had to do. He was determined, and he was compelled by God to do that, because if he didn't, the whole thing would have collapsed. He must have done. He must do that for Jesus to be, to go through the week of passion and all the torture and then eventually put on the cross. All of that had to happen. And we're gonna go to the stories. There are three different stories about Judas after the crucifixion, and because the different stories have different significance. But what do you think about that idea that Jesus knew it's all part of the plan? Calm down. We know what's going on. It was going to happen. Would it then sort of raise the question: how can somebody be an evil person if he actually had no choice in the matter? He had to do it.
Well, this is dealt with in one gospel where Jesus says, "The Son of Man goes as it is written of him," which must mean prophecy and all that. But woe to the man by whom he goes. It would have been better for him never to have been born at all. Which kind of recalls something like in the story of Joseph in Genesis, in this great scene where his brothers are dining with him, the Grand Vizier of Egypt by now, and they have no idea who he is. And when he reveals himself, he thinks, "Oh boy, we're dead." And he says, "No, don't worry. I know you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." Because if this hadn't happened with him being sold into slavery and becoming an Egyptian slave and then a dream interpreter and then the number two man in Egypt, then the famine would have killed everybody. But thanks to Joseph being in the position these events put him in, he saves the world. By telling Pharaoh what to do to stockpile the grain in view of the coming famine, etc. So it doesn't really absolve him of responsibility. It's kind of like providence, which seems to be a way of saying, yeah, it was prearranged, but you wouldn't have minded it. That God has turned the wicked. Well, in the people in the book of Acts, it says that those who had Jesus put to death were evilly motivated, but God brought victory out of defeat, and sort of a similar thing. That it's very complicated. In a way, Judas was being had, like he says in Superstar, in his final soliloquy. But they, at least that's how some of them thought of it. Now, this gets fascinatingly complex as well, because the thing in John, especially where he says, one of you guys is going to betray me this very night. Who? And there's this great takeoffs on this. Like, you ever heard the Irish version of the Last Supper, where Jesus says, "Sure, one of you is going to betray me," and they all go around the table. "Is it I, Lord? Is it I, Lord?" And then finally it comes to Judas and says, "Blimey, Lord, you can't mean me, can you?"
he's the Brit.
Anyway, and then there's this hilarious Mad TV thing I'm sure I've quoted before, where the Terminator goes back in time to save Jesus. And so he's there somehow at the Last Supper, and Judas is there, and suddenly the Terminator whips out his machine gun and drills him full of lead, and he collapses on the table, and Jesus says, "What are you doing?" "He was going to betray you." Look, this is the plan of God. And Jesus lays hands on Judas, raises him from the dead on the spot. He says, "Now, where were we?" And he says a bit more, and the Terminator kills him again. And Jesus is out of patience, and he says, "Look, stop killing Judas." And he says, "This is part of a plan. It has to happen this way." And then
Yeah.
it switches to the Via Dolorosa as Jesus is headed for the cross, for Golgotha, carrying the cross, and an old lady standing next to the Terminator is weeping, and he turns to her and says, "Don't worry, he'll be back." And brilliant. Anyway, is it possible that Judas didn't know but was chosen?
Mm,
Because the business about, it says, "Who is it, Lord? Who's going to betray you?" And he says, "Well, watch carefully. The one who happens to dip his piece of bread into the
yes.
sauce when I do, that'll be him." How did he know that? Well, it could be that he had foreknowledge of how it would happen, and presumably, I mean, that's the usual way to take it. But it's possible that that's a slightly theologically enhanced version of the arbitrary choice of a scapegoat that even
Yes.
Jesus didn't know who it would be.
But
But
Bob, we know that this is, I mean, John, obviously, the Gospel of John is completely different than the other three. We said that's high Christology, and it's a lot more theologically inspired type of writing. But you don't see that in the first three. As a matter of fact, sometimes there isn't even a motivation uh,
Mhm.
from Judas Iscariot. I believe the 30 pieces of silver weren't even mentioned in every single gospel. There may be one gospel that neglects to say that.
Yeah, that is fascinating. In Mark, he just volunteers to hand Jesus over, and they then offer to pay him for his trouble. In
Yeah.
Matthew, it's strategically changed so that Judas says to the Sanhedrin, "How much will you give me if I hand him over to you?" Well, in Luke and John, I don't think you have that scene. I know you don't in John, but instead, in both of those gospels, Satan possesses Judas, and
Yes.
that's the only motivation in Luke. He's demon possessed. You can picture his eyes suddenly glowing red and all of that.
Yeah.
But that's no real motive. And in John, what do we have? A harmonization. Satan enters into Judas, so he's going to betray him. But he's also a no good bum because he kept pilfering money out of the common fund.
Yeah.
Like,
But I'll
well,
tell
what?
you, Bob, the demonic position narrative, it fails completely, because this tells you that Lucifer is part of the plan.
Yeah, yeah.
He's actually
He wants
helping
it to
God's
happen.
cause. If Lucifer was smart enough, and he usually is, he would do everything in his not for this to be fulfilled. So he would not possess Judas for him to give to the Jews, for him to be crucified. He would actually try to avoid that. He actually ended up being the tool for God. Um, if this is the case.
Yeah, in Mark and Matthew, remember the Caesarea Philippi scene where Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" "Oh, this, that, and the other thing. What about you? What do you think?" And they say, "Oh, you're the Christ." Peter says, "The Messiah." And Jesus says, "Okay, you're ready for the next thing. The Son of Man has to be handed over to men and betrayed and crucified and so on." And Peter rebukes him, it says, and Jesus says, "Get out of my sight, Satan. You're thinking like men do, not like God." Well, if that implies, if Satan knew what was going on, he would try
Yes.
to do what you just tried to do. And so, does he mean Satan actually does? You're unwittingly a tool of Satan? Or is he saying you're thinking like he would? But and in Matthew, it's even more elaborate. But the idea is that he's Peter is basically giving the satanic um, agenda there, whereas in implying he wouldn't want this. And this kind of harks back to First Corinthians, where Judas is not mentioned, but it says the archons of this age put Jesus to death, not knowing what they were doing, because in doing so, they sealed their own death warrant. What does that mean? Well, they did want to engineer Jesus' death, but didn't know what the plan was. So it gets, there's, of course, this is speculation. Even if these narratives are accurate, you would have to ask, how would the characters involved know? And
Yeah. So let's skip to the point where, okay, he was handed over, got crucified, and was raised from the dead after 3 days. And the news about Jesus appearing to the 500 started to spread. Was that then enough motivation for Judas Iscariot to say, "Uh-oh, looks like I screwed up at that point," and you end up with the different stories about his fate, and maybe you take us through the different, horrible endings. He, especially the one with his bowels opening up from falling like a head plant.
yeah, in Matthew, he doesn't have to wait for a resurrection. That one is well articulated in Superstar. He sees what is happening to Jesus, and somehow he never envisaged this, and he throws the money back to the, here, take your stinking blood money. I've betrayed innocent blood, and he just can't live with himself, and he then hangs himself. And this is before the resurrection, even. In Luke, we're told that, let's see, that he takes the money. He doesn't give it back to the Sanhedrin. He takes the money and buys a field in
Yes.
which it says he, depending on how you translate the Greek, he either fell headlong, which seems kind of odd. He's in a field, a flat area. So did he just, I mean, if you just trip over something and fall, your bowels don't explode, right? I mean, maybe he had severe
Weird. Yeah.
diarrhea or something, but that's not what they seem to mean. And then in Papias, probably contemporary, early 2nd century, he has this story that assumes that the Greek meant that he burst asunder, because it says that eventually that Judas was still around for some time after the betrayal and was turned into monstrous form, that his head swelled up to the proportions of a parade float, so that he couldn't even wedge himself through buildings in an intersection. That's the way they put it. And he was in the habit of urinating worms. And like, what else can we pile on this guy? And that finally, like Mr. Creosote in Monty Python's Meaning of Life, he just exploded. You can imagine the cleanup job on that one. So this is a grossly exaggerated version. But the first one, the hanging, looks suspiciously like, I think it's Ahithophel, an advisor of David who betrayed him and hanged himself. The other one seems to be based on a description of the death of Antiochus Epiphanes in, I think, First Maccabees, that he was just dead of some sort of internal rot, and that his bowels gushed out like through his bottom, I guess, but is something that's disgusting, but possible and plausible. So what's the story there? That implies nobody knows what happened to Judas. If there was a Judas, right? I mentioned how some say Judas was just a narrative incarnation of Jews generally, but you can go a little bit deeper into that, because on the one hand, in First Corinthians, it says, on the night on which he was betrayed, and then it goes into a supper scene. Well, the word paradidomi can mean betrayed, but doesn't have to. It also commonly means handed over. And that would fit. And in fact, elsewhere in the Pauline material, you have it said that God handed Jesus over or delivered him up for our sins. So is that possibly what it meant? Well, some people didn't realize that and thought, according to the theory, they figured, oh, somebody actually backstabbed Jesus. What's So they created a character who's conveniently called the betrayer. Now, something that makes that plausible is that in the arrest scenes, Judas's presence, his role seems to be superfluous. Did they really need Judas to find Jesus? I mean, it would have been easy enough to follow him
But,
right
but, but
outside
you
Jerusalem.
would think so, but even he had to kiss him to,
Yeah,
to signal.
but that's even worse
Yeah,
because
no.
it's like the arresting party saying, "Hey, which one of you guys is Elvis?" Like, why
Yeah,
do they want to get rid of him? Because everybody knows him. He's so popular, but they can't recognize him.
that's
Uh,
weird. Yeah.
Later, Islamic commentators ingeniously said this is because God caused all of the 12 to assume the appearance of Jesus. So they were all his twins. And they said, which one's the real Jesus? And that, of course, that's ridiculous, though ingenious. So he says the one I kiss is the man. But why do they need that? And in John's gospel, there's nothing about that. Even he doesn't kiss him. Uh, so what is going on here? It seems like he's been inserted into a story where he doesn't belong, and that kind of backs up the idea that there was no such character until some lunkhead thought he was handed over, meant somebody close to him ratted him out.
Yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. How can he be so famous and such a threat for the kingdom, and yet they can't even recognize him? It's something very strange going on. Thank you, Constellation Pegasus, for the super chat. And he's basically, it's a comment to say conversations like this made me lose faith in Christianity. How can the creator of the universe have books written with so many holes and doubts in them? It becomes stupid after a while and tiring. I mean, we digress a little bit here. Were all these inconsistencies, as you study the Bible, Bob, sort of made you, or at least the reasons why you kind of moved away from? Were you ever faithful at some point?
Me or Consolation Pegasus?
Yourself, yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I was an inerrantist. Believed the Bible was infallible and that everything it said happened, did occur. But it was this kind of thing that made me realize it's just too much funny business going on trying to harmonize all this stuff. And so I shifted over eventually to the limited inerrancy position where people said, well, all right, you're asking too much. What did we really need to know from God by way of revelation? Well, it was ethics and how to be saved, wasn't it? Well, that stuff doesn't stand or fall with this kind of trivia. And I mean, we might like to know, but do we really need to know exactly what happened with Judas, for example, or how many animals Jesus rode into Jerusalem? I mean, is that really the point of the Bible? And Roman Catholics came up with that before revisionist evangelicals did. But yeah, others said, like liberal Protestants, kind of um, leapfrog that and said, well, look, this is only a problem if you say God virtually dictated the Bible. He wouldn't have gotten anything wrong. Well, okay, the error there is that it's not an inspired book, a magic book. It's the product of inspired individuals who had a whole lot of religious and moral insights. Of course, they did not have privileged access to what had happened in the past, except the basic thing, which everybody knew anyway. They figured it wasn't really controversial. Jesus was crucified and people saw him afterward, etc. So there were different ways of dealing with this, but what I think is the nail in the coffin is that once you start down that road, the next thing you do is to recognize that the New Testament writers, just sticking with that for the moment, they don't even agree on doctrinal matters.
Mhm.
Some of them also don't really matter much. Like, is Jesus going to reign as the Messiah through the millennium? I mean, who cares really? But in Revelation, yes. But apparently in 1 Corinthians 15, no. According to Ephesians, yes. Well, wait a second. That's kind of a biggie. How about Jesus saying that the end of the world is coming in his lifetime? Once you see through the ridiculous dodges offered to redeem that, when you realize, no, come on now. Did Jesus, what if Jesus said that, was he simply wrong? Well, if he was, what kind of a revealer is he? What reason do we have for thinking he knew any better about anything else he said?
Yeah.
And of course, you could say, well, maybe he didn't say that, and some hothead put that into the mouth of Jesus. He didn't really say it. Uh-oh, you're prying open the lid on Pandora's box. But then, because then it comes into question, how do we know what Jesus said? Because there are contradictions there. And eventually, though some liberal Protestants and Catholics will say, well, it is nonetheless inspired. God simply inspired a diversity of opinions, and God was not above using legends and myths to teach us, even in the story of Jesus. Well, all right, individually, those arguments kind of make sense. But what are you left with? In what sense is the Bible authoritative anymore? To say that it's inspired is like saying it's blue. I mean, you're not. It doesn't really mean anything anymore. And so I think, yeah, it edged me out of the whole thing. Now, I love the Bible, and I find myself all the time quoting wise things from it. But like Robin Scroggs, a New Testament scholar at the University of Chicago, said, uh, surely for us, the authority of the Bible is what we recognize in it, what we would have agreed with when we heard it, no matter who said it or where we read it. And that I don't know what inspiration has to do with that. That seems to me to be sufficient for us to take the Bible seriously, but epistemologically, it surely is not. The Bible does not become a book of revelations about an invisible world and a salvific future or anything like that.
Couple of things to cover before we talk about the ultimate ending. Obviously, once he's dead, and this shows how trivial the situation is, he vacated the seat of the 12. You know, that 12, that magical number has to be intact. Somebody took his place, right? And the 12.
Matthias.
Yes. Yeah. So it's almost like it's so important, to God. You got to have that number. You can't tamper with the magical heavenly 7 and 12. These are magical numbers. You cannot play with them. And was there any mention of Judas outside of the betrayal narrative, like in a normal conversation?
Only in the list in Mark and Matthew, where it just comments already who was to betray him.
Yeah.
And similarly in John chapter 6, the crowd is largely disillusioned with Jesus because they're confused at what he said about the bread of life and all that. And a lot of them just say, well, that's too much for me. I'm looking elsewhere for a Messiah. And Jesus turns to the 12 and say, well, what about you? Are you going to leave also? And Peter says, how can we? I mean, we've heard and understood that you're the Holy One of God. You're the only one that has the words of eternal life. And then it says, yeah, but Jesus didn't trust himself to them because he knew what was in the heart of man and who would betray him. And he says, have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil. Well, and it's for he knew who would betray him. doesn't name him, but you know who he means. But I don't really think there's no calling narrative for Judas. It's one of the things I love the most about the last temptation of Christ is that Judas is, they do prepare the ground and make him into a zealot and so forth. And Harvey Keitel is just great as
Yes,
Judas.
I love Harvey Keitel.
Oh boy.
I love it. I mean, it's Harvey Keitel. I remember him in the Quentin Tarantino, the guy who comes up to clean up the mess in Pulp Fiction, with his
Now,
tuxedo.
This is interesting. You mentioned that. He's just like Judas because he has no role there. What does he do? He says, "Well, you better wash the car." Yeah. I mean, you need a specialist to tell you that. What was Tarantino thinking?
Oh, I think it's genius. I think it shows. It's almost like this narrative. It shows that every single disciple is installed for a reason, and the one reason for Judas Iscariot to even exist, he's almost like he was created only for this purpose. That's Judas Iscariot's purpose,
right.
And it's such an important one because if he didn't do what he did, the whole salvation thing is over. It's just it's not there. So he's so important. That's why in the Gospel of Judas, he's revered as the highest of all saints. He's the one. He's the one that let it all happen. A very important man.
Yeah, it's like he's the high priest delivering the sacrifice.
Yeah.
I think the Canaanite Gnostics believed that. And the Gospel of Judas, the real one, whether we have it or not, I think was supposed to be a Canaanite work.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you again for another super chat. But I mean, he makes a very good point, and this is the point that I've always debated, even in the Quran or the Bible or one of the reasons I lost my faith is the conveyance of God's wisdom through language. Once you put things into language, it requires perception, and perception is subjective. Things will be understood, and it's not like we're conniving or horrible or anything. Just being completely genuine. You and I might hear one statement, and out of pure heart and out of complete devotion, you would understand it in a slightly different way than I would understand it, because you've had different experiences in life. You've got a different understanding of certain words and keywords and vocabulary. So you're, and I cannot condemn you for that. Otherwise, you're not who you are. So why would God always insist in conveying his important messages to humanity through a tool, the reception of which is quite subjective?
The ancient Greeks seem to have understood this. For one thing, one of the sophists, Gorgias, whom Socrates is shown debating with, he believed that communication was ultimately impossible because of this. We don't necessarily understand the same thing but the same words. Now, he was carrying a bit too far, but the point was an interesting one. The Oracle of Delphi, she always gave equivocal oracles. They were the word of God coming from Apollo, but they could be taken different ways. If you go to war, a mighty empire will fall. Oh boy, that's just what I wanted to hear. Yours. And it could mean one thing or another, or like the oracle says, Socrates is the wisest man in Athens. And Socrates says, well, no, that can't be true, and I'm going to prove it. He interviews all these supposedly wise people, and says, son of a gun, the oracle was right, because I'm the only one in town that knows he's not wise. Well, that was equivocal, and he had to come up with the possible meaning. And if he didn't, that's too bad for him. Now, in modern times, Jacques Derrida kind of revived this in his principle of difference. That is the same word as difference with an E, but with an A. So he would have said difference. And he said differing and deferring is what this means. And he says, language always leads astray. You think it's going to convey some meaning, but the meaning is always deferred because there's an inherent fissure in language itself.
Yes.
There's no possible definitive meaning because meaning is not referential. Like this is a pair of glasses. Well, that seems simple enough, but it very often is not. And because we hear different things, as you said, and because words mean different things. There's a crack right down the middle because the meaning is differential. Any word means is like the trace, the opposite outline of the puzzle piece next to it. And it's very difficult, and there's no trend. They're all signifiers, but
So you just said a crack right down the middle. A crack, the word crack in Ireland means something different.
There you go.
Let's have a crack means a laugh. We had a good old crack, and it's funny. Words mean different things in different locations, but it's a tool to transfer thoughts, and that's why in superhero movies, telepathy is always more superior to communication through language, because that's it. You get to the bottom line. If you can communicate with thoughts, there is no misunderstanding.
That's right. And that's the point Simon Magus makes against Peter when he says, like Peter says, how do you get the nerve to say you're an apostle of Jesus? You never even met him. We knew him for years and heard what he had to say. What you get yours in a dream? Come on. And Simon's response is, look, don't you know what happens when somebody teaches orally? There's always ambiguity. Like, didn't you say, "Blessed are the cheesemakers"? And he says, "No, you can never be sure you're being heard." And but if it's revealed to you subjectively by a revelation, you know what it means. There's no doubt. It's like God's telepathy to the prophet. So that's right. Derrida says that you seem to think that the use of words is like telepathy, gaining immediate access to the hearer's mind, but that is not the case, and it cannot be the case because of the nature of language. It's so fascinating.
It's intrinsic.
The book of Revelation is all about this, in my opinion. There's this ongoing debate between written numbers and words and the living word and so on. But at any rate, I think he's entirely right.
Did you know, Bob, that there is an Irish version of the Gospel of the Bible where Judas kisses Jesus 3 times, not once? So on the right cheek, on the left cheek, and then again on the right. You know why? To be sure, to be sure, to be sure. Wow. That's a joke.
Wow. I find some of the best theology in jokes.
Well, I mean, when you take this sort of lightly, this cannot have happened. This can only fit if the story is made up, or it's supposed to be like an allegory. And you have all these installments of the almost Jungian archetypes to represent almost groups of people, not just one person. Mm-hmm. So Judas is a group.
Yeah.
Makes more sense like that.
Yeah. Otherwise, ridiculous questions come to the fore. And like the Jesus riding the 2 donkeys into Jerusalem.
Oh, yeah.
We know what happened. Matthew wasn't an idiot. But the reason he's writing it that way is that he's using an exegetical technique used by the rabbis, to where even though they wrote poetry and understood that if they wrote a reference to the donkey, the foal of an ass, it meant a purebred donkey, a single animal. But if you found it in the Bible, you had to wring any possible meaning out of it. And so you treated poetry like prose in the Bible. And that's what Matthew is doing. He's not trying to tell you exactly what happened. This is a way of saying this is a fulfillment of this prophecy. And you have to know that kind of thing, but it doesn't really fit with this idea the Bible is historically inerrant.
And I hear as well, a lot of people, like even Bart Ehrman said that, and I'm not sure if you agree with him. Certain, it's written in Koine Greek, but certain things will be better understood when they're translated back into Aramaic.
Mm-hmm.
The phrases and the context would make more sense. Do you find that sort of accurate?
Yeah, rarely, but sometimes. I'm pleasantly surprised to hear him say that, because that was the theory of Charles Cutler Torrey, who thought that the Gospels were all originally written in Aramaic. And it's a very interesting theory. It's a little weak on definitive evidence, but occasionally there are, because he pulls up instances, just like what you said, that this would make better sense if it was originally in Aramaic and could have meant a couple of things, and the Greek translator picked the wrong one. For instance, one that George Lamsa, who also believed that, used to point out, when it says that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. And he said, well, actually, the word, which happens to sound like it, gamal, in Aramaic, could mean either camel or cable. I mean, that's a great example, because fortuitously it kind of sounds like these things even in English. And he says, surely what the original point of the metaphor was, it's easier to drag a cable through the eye of a needle. You might conceivably try it, though. Nah, you wouldn't. You knew it's impossible. But the other metaphor, a camel? What the heck? But then that's been shot down by other scholars that say, actually, we have a rabbinic parallel where it says it's easier to squeeze an elephant through the eye of a needle than to do so and so. So that kind of thing was legitimate.
And you would think the camels, being sort of the most common, sort of one of the most common animals around that area, would be a lot more understood than a cable. So it's probably an easier one to understand. But remember, there's another situation here. Maybe the translators were not native Greek speakers.
No, that's right.
So when they translate, it's almost like when you are when you learn another language, a foreign language, but you're a native Aramaic, but you happen to be one of the educated ones who can read and write in Greek. You still have to think the story in your original language and then translate it, and then you end up with the loopholes and the weaknesses. But if it's written, imagine if the whole thing was Greek, is written by a native Greek speaker, things will be a lot more consistent. So I'm thinking, Josephus, for example. Josephus, was he able to write in Greek?
I think he had it translated. I could be wrong, but I know he wrote in Aramaic, and at least some of it was translated, maybe all of it.
Yeah, because obviously he eventually get adopted by his new, almost like nationality, and takes it in a surname. And he might have learned at that point. And if he were to translate something into Greek, he would translate it in a way that it will show certain weaknesses, because he's not a native Greek speaker. He would have to think in Aramaic and then translate it, and then things will look funny. Will sound funny.
That's what Torrey says about the Aramaic Gospels being translated into Greek. The result, he says, is translation Greek. exactly what you're saying.
Yeah,
My favorite example that I just am so tempted by, when Jesus, one of the anointing stories, Jesus and his disciples are at the house of Simon the leper, and the unnamed woman breaks open a jar of pure spikenard and anoints Jesus. And the disciples or somebody on the scene objects, this is a terrible waste, and so forth. Well, what's he going? How could he be going to dinner at the house of a leper? Right? You're off limits. You're a pariah, an outcast. And I guess it's possible that people used to call him that when he had leprosy, but now he was cured of it. But that seems kind of odd too. But what do you know? In Aramaic, the word that must underlie leper in that story can also mean, I don't know how, jar merchant. Well, what do you know? That really
makes
solves
more
the whole
sense.
problem.
Yeah.
And so I really have to think that that's what happened, though who knows? But yeah, that could be. And there you go again. That's why translation of anything is so difficult, because the words never quite correspond.
Absolutely, and it's words are. I mean, again, that's an inherent problem in the language. Words are moving targets, and we talked about the word "gay" in the 1940s
Yeah,
and 1950s would mean something completely different than the word "gay" today,
yeah,
because words are living beings almost. Like right
yeah,
now, the kids these days will go and say, "Oh my God, this ride is sick," as in it's a cool thing. Sick here means something great or fun or something, but they call it sick. This is a
yeah.
stick, I was like, what? But here we go, the
Stupid
word's birth.
denotes the same sort of a thing. This is stupid, clever. What the heck? What are you talking about? Or sketchy. When did
Sketchy.
that come to mean dubious?
Yeah,
Uh,
sketchy. Yeah, it's but that's again, so imagine another 200 or 300 years from now.
mhm.
Apparently there's about 12,000 words per day that emerge. It's
Oh,
crazy. It's incredible. And imagine as more modern stuff are invented, we need to keep finding new words, and old words are going to be gone. Like you show a kid, one of my favorite shows now is showing Stranger Things, and it's themes after the 80s. And some of the kids would watch a cassette, and he's
mm.
what the hell is that?
Yeah, like
And
an eight-track. I had
yeah,
already been consigned to the dustbin of history.
yeah. And the pencil, you remember how you used to fix it, where it rolls, and you use the pencil to roll it back, and even use
Yeah,
the to put the tape back together. Use, I think it was a nail polish at some point, to
yeah, yeah.
all the old tricks. But the kids these days, I mean, you don't blame them because they were they don't have a name for this thing. That what the hell is that?
Yeah.
Guardian of the Galaxy, I think he's does the same thing because he's frozen in time and he's got his Walkman and dancing away with his Walkman, 80s
Yeah,
Walkman.
yeah. It's so hilarious. Uh, and I mean, you got a great basis for a comedy of errors just with that alone. I don't think I've ever seen anything where they've made really good full usage of that. And you'd think they would. Probably they haven't. I haven't seen it.
Well, I mean, Monty Python was a very big, the first start, and I remember back in, I think in the UK it had a bit of wrath. People didn't like it, and in the cinemas, and they even threatened to do certain things. But now it's the life of Brian and the creative life is one of my but it uses a lot of sarcasm. I think if they do one today, but we live in a completely politically correct world. Things like that won't fly, and Netflix would have canceled it in a heartbeat because of the outcry. But the amount of comedy that can come out of it will be fantastic, I think.
Mm. Well, I just saw Ralph Ellis just posted a snippet from the life of Brian that I've been thinking about constantly, where People's Front of Judea. They're sitting around trying to put together a manifesto. And so, it's the inherent right of every man or woman to so and so, so and so, every man or woman. Stan, why are you always going on about women? Because I'm crying. And Judith says, look, how about if we put it this way? Every man has the right to have children, even though he can't have children. And they say, okay, that's good. And Reg says, what's the point? How can you have a right to do something you can't do? And she says, I think it's symbolic of our struggle against oppression. And then as an aside, Reg says, it's symbolic of his struggle against reality. Ralph said this could not be made today because it describes exactly what is going on.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like real prophecy.
Yeah, yeah. It's when people were not taking themselves too seriously, and I think we do a lot better when we have that stance, when we're not taking ourselves too seriously. I think as the world is, it's not even serious. It's like, you got to be seen to be saying certain things. Otherwise, you are endangering yourself to become not accepted by the groups. You're out of the group because even though you could be doing it at home, or as long as you're not seen doing, or doesn't matter conviction, it doesn't matter principles or persuasion. No. All what you have to do is just have that facade at least. And back home, you can do whatever you want. This is a very phony world, sketchy world.
I just reviewed a really good book where, however, there's this jarring habit of the author to never use the term son of man, but to put child of the human. And I commented on this, and I said, well, if it matters, that's the Nestorian heresy. It implies that Jesus, the Son of Man, was of indeterminate gender, but that can't be, because the whole idea of the Cyril's view was that no, the incarnation goes all the way down, unlike Nestorianism that said, well, Jesus as an infant wasn't God. And Cyril says, well, yes, he was, unless you want to say that the guy suffering on the cross wasn't God either. That's the scandal of the incarnation. Well, anyway, I said, and beside that, I think this guy ought to remember that the gospel says, be careful not to do your virtue signaling before men.
Yeah. The word man for me always meant, in the way it's like, not with bread only man can live. To me, that means humanity. Even like phrases like manslaughter. What are you going to do with that? Is it going to be a person slaughter? So they would gender. So when you say manslaughter, you know what we're talking about. We're talking about humans, right? So, it's crazy. The world is really, really. The world is burning. Fuel prices are going up. Crazy living, inflations, and instead of facing the real issues, we're worried about names for certain things. And not even so. Let's get the names right, and it doesn't matter about real state of women in third world countries. So, but let's be seen to be saying the right things. Doesn't matter the real action.
Because that is the real action that they're concerned about. They live in a fantasy world where language is reality, whereas it's not out in the big bad world. Though there is a link, because the same people that want to impoverish us to enrich the oligarchs further, like Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and people like this, that they want to impoverish the peasants so they can own everything. And part of this is to impose Orwellian style newspeak and double think and so forth. So it's like, again, Orwell was a predictive prophet. and or somebody decided, hey, this is great. This is the blueprint for what we're going to do. And
Orwell was a genius. 1984 is a genius novel. I think
oh yeah,
it's. I mean, we're talking if anything close to omniscience, that would be it.
mm-hmm.
So we've digressed a bit, but let's go back to maybe the final bit of the episode, back to our man Judas Iscariot, because we're going to link him a little bit to the Islamic version, because one of the things that the Muslims came up with at the crucifixion is Jesus was never crucified. He was made to look like him, but he was made to look like him by having another person looking like him. And who would that person be? Can't be an innocent person, otherwise God is really committing evil. Has to be somebody who's horrible. And who is the most horrible person in this narrative who could look like Jesus? So Judas. Would Judas be the person who looked temporarily like Jesus, and it will be kind of killing two birds at the same time, really? You're getting the crucifixion done, and you're taking revenge on the spot of the man responsible of the evil acts.
Yeah, some Islamic scholars said it was Judas. Others said it was Pontius Pilate.
Yes.
Somebody said it was Sergius, who was some sort of a Roman spy among the circle of Jesus. And I forget.
But the poor Pontius Pilate, you remember, he kept asking, "Are you sure, guys? Are you sure, guys? You want me to?" He was so he didn't care, He wanted to give him the thief, I was like, "You sure? You sure that there is a guy actually who committed a crime here? I could actually do him instead." And they kept, no, we want him. So he hasn't done much, really.
Yeah, though that was one of the options, at least probably a weaker one because of that. Yeah.
Judas would be quite the candidates, and it will fulfill the Islamic promise that Jesus, as a revered prophet of God, of Allah, he cannot be killed. That's not the destiny and the fate of somebody who's made sacred by God. It will not be allowed.
Yeah, I think that there must have been docetic Christians that thought the same thing, like we read about in a couple of the Nag Hammadi texts, where in one of them, Jesus summons John to a cave in the Mount of Olives while he's ostensibly being crucified. And he says, "You see that guy? They think it's me, but it's not." And it's not clear whether it's like a hologram or that it's merely the body, which is not the real Jesus. It's not that clear. But he says they will lie and say they crucified me, but in fact they didn't. Well, or there were these other, like the possibility that Simon of Cyrene was crucified, as I think Basilides thought. I think something like that is in view when in Matthew, when Peter says, "Oh, God forbid, Lord, this must never happen to you." They're trying to depict a Christian opinion that, that didn't happen to him. Or at least somebody thought that, and that Jesus is saying, "Oh, no, you're crazy."
But you see, Bob, this is the gymnastics of language, because you could argue then, what is the definition of you and I? It's not the body. If you and I, in essence, is the spirit, that body that's being crucified is not really you or me.
Yeah.
It's just the vessel, Mm-hmm. The real essence is free, and forever is going to be free. You can't touch the essence.
That's right. Plus, language, here's another great example of that. Basilides' view was based on the fact that in Mark, it says that Jesus went out, etc., and they commandeered a man from the crowd, Simon from Cyrene. They brought him to the place of a skull, and there they crucified him. Well, what's the last proper name before the pronoun him? Well, it's not Jesus, it's Simon. And he said that Mark is trying to tell you that it was Simon who was crucified, not Jesus. Whoa. And there were people that apparently believed that. Simon Magus supposedly said he was crucified in Judea. Uh, Woo, boy. There's so many weird things going on in early Christian texts that it makes it impossible ever to settle any of this,
Yeah.
despite the smug assurances of apologists.
His fate. So we talked about the field of blood, where his own blood
Hmm.
sort of gushes on the field, and so you got like the multiple stories. Is there a story where he survived and he lived happy ever after, or gone somewhere? With the Dan Brown narrative, Jesus gone to Paris, to France, to Mary Magdalene. Is there any wacky stories of Judas Iscariot where he carried on?
There is a modern novel. Um, hmm, I read a whole bunch of these to write a book. I forget which one it is, but in it he does survive somehow supernaturally, but as a otherwise mortal man on into our day, and finally ascends into heaven, though he's been kind of a creep the whole time. Um, there's the legend of the wandering Jew.
Yeah,
It,
I'm googling because I remember watching a movie some time ago where a vampire was being sort of chased the entire movie, and eventually they get to the backstory of that vampire, and ends up being that's the very
uh,
first vampire, and that he ended up being Judas Iscariot. And I'm trying to find
Interesting.
it. Yeah,
There were loads of versions of this, and in all of them, um, he was a Jew who was there on the Via Dolorosa, and he was just the opposite of Saint Veronica, who gave Jesus something to drink. Um, well, in this elaboration of that story, this guy slugged Jesus. He didn't believe in him yet. False prophet, take that. And Jesus turned to him, not in a forgiving mood, and said, "Tarry thou till I come again." And so this guy, what? Well, it turns out he wouldn't grow older. He wouldn't die. He was condemned to wander the earth, witnessing the horrors inflicted on the Jewish people for century after century, and by this time he had repented and knew that this was his penance for what he had done. And so he had at least three different names. Some called him Bata Deus, the God Smiter. Some called him Ahasuerus, which is just the Hebrew for Artaxerxes, the Persian king. I don't know where they got that one from. And others called him Joseph Cartaphilus, Joseph of the heart of love, because he had repented. And finally, when Christ comes back, he'll be released from his chronological bondage. But it amazes me that this character was not supposed to be Judas. I mean, I wonder if there was a version in which there was, but there are at least three big novels from probably the 19th century about this guy, and there are various works about him and many different versions of it. But I don't think anybody ever ID'd him with Judas, and it seems like the obvious thing.
yeah. I found the movie. I'll put the link here for folks if they're interested. It's called Count Dracula, and it's a movie by Wes Craven. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's the horror movie giant. Made a lot of horror movies, and yeah, there's a backstory about Dracula being Judas Iscariot, and it's to do with the blood, the drinking of the blood. I think it's the field of blood. The blood was always sort of around the Judas Iscariot. Even I think they were showing him committing suicide. He kind of halfway between life and death, and a demon comes and asks him to drink from his own blood.
Huh.
And when he did that, he had a taste, and he got resurrected, but in a different form, which is the undead Dracula. So that's created the first Dracula. It's quite interesting.
Fascinating. They have another version of it in a movie I really love called The Seventh Sign.
Oh yes,
did you see that?
yes, yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The wandering Jew becomes the wandering Roman in that one, and he's the centurion that tormented Jesus in some way, and that's a kind of a variant on it. Joseph Smith, this motif comes up in the Johannine appendix, that is chapter 21 of John, added by somebody else, where Jesus foretells the martyrdom of Peter. And Peter turns around and points to the beloved disciple and says, well, what's going to happen to him? And he says, that's none of your business. If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? Some have thought he did. And there's I think a trilogy book about cloning Christ from the Shroud of Turin, and that John is the beloved disciple, and that he comes to explain what's happened, and asks if the researcher has heard of Adolf Harnack, because he said so. It's really great, and it capitalizes on that he meant it. And Joseph Smith does that too, with the three witnesses and so on. It's fascinating.
I mean, C.S. Lewis, he made sort of a name, adopting the Bible to some sort of fantasy. I think what's the name of the lion from Narnia? Aslan. I think Aslan is Jesus. I think.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. It's quite interesting narrative, and they're not really. I mean, all these stories are from real life. You have the betrayer is there. He's always among us. The one who would sacrifice himself, the altruistic guy, the jealous person, the zealot. All these characters are represented in today's society. We can see all of them. So all what humanity's done is they just transfer that into a story.
Yeah, because stories are scripts for how we choose to live, or how we have been cast in a role by society or parents or whatever. It's so profound.
Exactly. Thank you, Constellation Pegasus, for the super chat. He's wondering. He's like, oh yeah, like Pontius Pilate and Judas Iscariot taking part in the execution is something. He said a flat Earth is more plausible. This is insanity to him, and I actually would tend to agree. Thank you, Robert. Robert is at work and listening in, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, Judas Iscariot, so he's going to remain. What is your final verdict on him? You don't think, I mean, kind of your conviction is the whole Jesus Christ situation is a myth. It's a story to teach us few lessons in life. That's what the whole idea is. But these people never really existed, or they could have been Frankenstein of like stitched up together of different people to make the Jesus and to make the Judas.
Yeah, that could well be. I mean, I am anything but a dogmatist about mythicism. There might have been a Jesus. It's just that if there was, any evidence that is worth anything has disappeared. So what reason is there to believe it? The old Occam's razor thing. It's easier to explain where we got a literary Jesus, but in that case, The idea that there was a historical Jesus behind it is really superfluous. It's a fifth wheel. Judas, the same thing. And again, there are problems with his role in the narrative, and it kind of makes more sense after without him, which implies that somewhere along the line, he was the first one of these supplementary characters like the Wandering Jew and Saint Veronica and so forth that get tacked onto the story like barnacles on the hull of a ship.
Yeah. Well, it seems that I mean, I think we're going to continue our gospel conversation. We're going to pick different, maybe what seems to be trivial side. I love side stories. I never, focusing on the main theme is quite interesting, but sometimes you find a lot more truth, and you find a lot more information on the little side stories. So I like to tackle the trivial things that were happening. The people that don't seem to be very significant. Mary Magdalene. I want to talk about these people because these are the cronies around Jesus, and they're supposed to be playing sort of a supporting acting role. But I like to put some limelight on them going forward.
Yeah, I have ideas about Mary Magdalene, and that she was a fascinating character. And
oh, I agree. She might be a representation of again, a group, and not just a group, not just women, a group within women, a type within women. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, me too, as always.
Of course. And folks, hopefully you enjoyed the conversation about Judas Iscariot. We're going to see you over the next few weeks with more themes from the gospel. As we said, we're going to try to focus on areas that maybe other speakers have not really focused about too much. Jesus seems to be the one who always steals the limelight from all these magnificent supporting actors who I think deserve a bit of love from us at some point. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, and especially thank you, Bob. I've got a quick consolation because he's always had the habit of just before you finish, he throws in a super chat.
Sounds good.
How about another gun show? Supreme Court says law-abiding citizen can have guns now. A good decision. Okay, so you're aware of this? A law has been passed already?
Yeah, the Supreme Court knocked down a long-standing law in New York that made it so you had to really jump through a lot of hoops to get permission to publicly carry a weapon, even for self-defense. Like even if the law allowed you to buy the gun, you couldn't carry it openly unless you could prove that you were in danger by some stalker or something. And it's not that easy to do. And so it was a way of cutting down the availability. And so the Supreme Court said there's nothing in the Constitution that would nuance the right to bear arms that way. And so forget it. You don't have to prove the unprovable, and you can conceal and carry and so forth. And this created hysteria among gun control people who don't seem to realize that the people that commit crimes with guns are criminals who usually have stolen the guns, and that trying to take guns away from law-abiding people is simply setting them up to be defenseless. So that's why there is a huge uproar currently, to the point where Keith Olbermann, who's sort of nuts.
We talked about it. I'm convinced it's too complex and too nuanced. You can't just do it. And if it's going to be done, it's probably going to take, I'm not exaggerating, it might take decades, maybe 100 years to because it has to be very gradual and very slow. And you're going to have to do a cleansing at the syndicates and the gangs. And this is going to take so much effort. For it to happen one day, but it's not going to be tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, Oberman said we ought to abolish the Supreme Court because he doesn't like rulings like this. There's a great idea. Sheesh.
No, you can't. I mean, you'll have to discuss it at a constitutional level, not a federal law. It has to go from, and you gotta. This is going to be debate, and even if you debate it, and if you're convinced about the principles of it, to actually make it happen, and this is what we talked about, and this is the bottleneck and the area of complication, the practicality of it, and the consequence of abandon. What would happen then, because this could be quite dangerous. Again, it's like the God situation in Nietzsche, where Nietzsche was running around scared, saying, "Don't take God away from people who, without God, might go nuts." You gotta fill up the vacuum first. You can't just pull and create a vacuum, just like Iraq situation and all these where you can't sort of try to apply democracy to countries who don't understand what democracy is.
Yeah.
You can say, sorry, we're going to pull out the dictator and that's going to sort things out. No, it's not going to. Probably the dictator is keeping things intact.
Yeah, that's certainly what happened with Yugoslavia. Look what happened when Marshal Tito and his buddies were out. Oh, a happy day. Uh-oh. Back to the Middle Ages with the Serbs and the Bosnians.
Yeah. So that's it's not pulling teeth. If you're gonna make a change like this, especially when it's completely entrenched and it's completely in the DNA of a nation, it has to come from bottom up. You cannot come from top down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's usually gradual and slow, but people have no patience. That's the problem. Thank you, Bob. I wish you good weekend or the rest of it. Well, it's the beginning of it. It's 2:00 in the morning here in Melbourne. So I know it's a bit late for me, but thank you so much for tuning in, and we're going to see you folks over the next few weeks with some new topics.